I'm Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University, and I'd like to welcome you to Books and Strikes. Books and Strikes is a show where we normally discuss books on baseball, which is what we are doing today. Sometimes we bring in people interrelated with baseball. Now, we're talking about a book called The St. Louis Browns, The Story of a Beloved Team. There are three authors to this book. One is Bill Borst, the other is Bill Rogers, and with me today is Ed Wheatley. They are all members of the St. Louis Browns Historical Society. Ed and I play against each other, just so we'll get that in there. There is a league here in St. Louis called the St. Louis Forever Baseball League. And there are three divisions in there. There is the 45 and over division, the 53 and over, and the 60 and over, and both of us play in the 60 and over division. So if any of you listening want to get back into playing baseball, and this is competitive hardball, that you can go online, find the website, and fill out the application. There are 8 teams going to be in existence for the 60 and over division beginning in 2018, and we start play probably in April, and we'll play through August or early September with a schedule of approximately 24 games. Now, Ed, your book. First, I went online and I was looking for other historical societies in other cities, figuring, well, everybody knows the Brooklyn Dodgers, and I followed the New York Giants because when I lived in New York, my father used to take me to the Polo Grounds repeatedly, so I remember very specifically seeing Leo DeRocher and Willie Mays, Don Mueller. But you don't find historical societies. In Brooklyn, within the Brooklyn Historical Society, they have sort of a subsection addressing the Dodgers, but not an independent entity. Why is it we end up seeing St. Louis Browns Historical Society, but we're not really seeing that anywhere else, similar to past teams?
Yeah, we always talk about that, and it has kind of tentacle effects. The St. Louis Browns Historical Society was founded in 1984 by Bill Borst, a New Yorker by trade, a lover of the Brooklyn Dodgers, who had been transplanted to St. Louis, and he had gone back to Pee Wee Reese's inauguration into the Hall of Fame, his induction. And he found out about the Brooklyn Dodgers Hall of Fame, fan club. And he got interested and said, well, why isn't there anything on the Browns? That Brooklyn Dodgers fan club folded about a decade ago. There is and was a fan club for the Philadelphia Athletics. It has pretty much shut down. There is one on the Boston Braves, and it's kind of a small, they put out like a newsletter. We are a little different. We still have over 500 members, and now that we've come up with this book, it's growing. I think we've grown about 75 to 100 just in the last 2 months of people not knowing, like you said, there's a fan club. And so we're different. We have annual luncheons every year where we bring in players. In September, we had Eddie Mickelson, who is 91. We had Don Larson. People forget Don Larson was a rookie with the Browns in 1953. He came. Whitey Herzog hired him come also, and he gave a testimonial to two of the great Browns, Ned Garver and Roy Sievers, who passed away, unfortunately, earlier this year. But he was a roommate and a teammate of both of them. Not with the Browns. He was a teammate of Ned Garver, and we'll talk about Ned Garver in a little while, who, when he was with the Athletics, and he was Roy Sievers' roommate in Washington. But the one thing that really has energized our fan club was so many of the Browns, when the team left St. Louis for the 54 season in Baltimore, many of them either didn't continue with Baltimore, or if they got cut or traded, they came back. And we had a whole core here in St. Louis, so there was a lot of camaraderie. So we would have annual luncheons, and you would get 15, 20, 30, 40 Browns, in that period of the 80s and 90s. And, it's slowly diminished. I got to admit right now that there are only 12 living members of the 764 men who played for the Browns. Last year at this time, we were in the 20s. So we're reaching that that peak. The oldest living Major League Baseball player, with the death of Bobby Doerr a couple weeks, is Chuck Stevens now. Oh. And he'll be 100 in July. So, and he played 3 years for the St. Louis Browns. So it's interesting. But we keep that core compassion of baseball here in St. Louis tied to the fan club.
Just let me give a quick, so some of the people hearing this going, yeah, St. Louis Browns. So they start in 1902, and they exist through 1953. They then leave 1954. They become the Baltimore Orioles. The American League starts in 1901, and so the idea was you wanted to put an American League team, hence the St. Louis Browns, and their name comes from the St. Louis Brown Stockings, which was a team here. And the reason, and sort of ironic to some extent, they picked St. Louis because they saw the Cardinals as the weakest team in the National League for 1902. And so as a result, now you're off the ground and running.
Right. You know, the National League had formed in 1876. And they had gyrations of different teams and size. At one time they were 8, then they were 12, and they went back to 8. The Cardinals joined the National League in 1892. So from 1892 to, as you said, 1902, the Cardinals were the only team in town. They weren't a strong team. They weren't a very good team. The Browns actually started the year earlier when the American League was formed in 1901 as the Milwaukee Brewers. Yeah. And Ban Johnson, the president of the American League, he moved the Milwaukee Brewers to St. Louis under the ownership of Mr. Arthwine, a famous name here in St. Louis local history, because he felt the Cardinals were a very weak team and just, they could be run out, which becomes the story of the next half century, the competition between the Cardinals and the Browns. And when the Browns came, they, for the next 2 decades, were the strongest team in St. Louis. The team loved the Browns. And in fact, in that first year, they did a raid and took the more popular players from the Cardinals and got them to join the Browns. So there was this eventual rivalry, not only between each other, but who would be the team that dominate St. Louis and live on. And there are several key things that happen in this 52-year history that, there's a lot of what-ifs that could have changed it.
There's a quote you had in the book. Let me read it. He says, a series of poor business decisions, personnel mismanagement, inefficiency on the field, too many subpar players, inflation, and a boatload of what can only be described as plain bad luck derailed the Browns.
Yep. That is absolutely true. There are some real key events that take place in the history of the Browns. And then there's just a lot of bad luck that happens. Probably if you take it kind of a chronological perspective, in a way he's a villain, but he is a key part of St. Louis baseball and actually Major League Baseball, and that's Branch Rickey. Branch Rickey started out as a catcher with the Browns. He's not a good catcher. He holds the record for most stolen bases against a catcher in the major leagues. Against Washington one day, 12 guys stolen, as the Washington Post highlighted. To steal against Branch Rickey, all you have to do is start running. But he was a baseball mind, and he became their manager, their general manager. But he was also a very large ego. And at that time, the Browns owner, Phillips DeCatsby Ball, also had a big ego. And Branch Rickey wanted to develop his idea of a farm system, which would become the minor leagues. And he wanted to do that with the Browns, but Ball did not have that foresight and vision that Branch Rickey had. The other thing was Branch Rickey then left and went to the Cardinals.
Which is in the same, which by this time they're both at Sportsmans Park, so you're in the same building.
Well, not yet, because Branch Rickey is the one who really initiates the Cardinals moving over to Sportsman's Park. The Sportsman's Park was always the Browns' stadium since they're coming to St. Louis. And the owner before Ball, Robert Hedges, he was real insightful. And, the one thing you'll find throughout the history of the Browns is how innovative they are, and sometimes ahead of their time. Sportsman's Park was all concrete and steel. I mean, he even tried putting a canvas roof over it in times. He put in a PA system. So there's all these firsts that took place in Sportsman's Park and the Browns. Now, The Cardinals played at a different field called Robeson Field over by Fairgrounds Park at Grand and Natural Bridge. And it was made of wood, as many of the stadiums were at that time, and it got condemned as a fire hazard. Well, Branch Rickey initiates this deal that the Cardinals, needing a stadium, came to the Browns and said, let's work a deal. Now, the Browns always wanted money, so, hey, here's cash, long-term cash. Now, the amount that they rented Sportsmans Park for wasn't a large amount in the scope of things. And then it was like, well, okay, now the Cardinals aren't having to maintain a stadium and all the personnel to maintain a stadium. They're paying out $20,000, $30,000 a year, and they're saving all this money. They turn around also and sell the ground where Robeson Field was, and that becomes Beaumont High School, which has an asterisk that, you know, for many years in the late 50s and early 60s, Beaumont High School had more major league players than any other high school in the country.
Yeah, you wrote that somewhere in the book. I saw that.
Yeah. You know, Earl Weaver went there, Roy Sievers went there. There's just, you can name athlete after athlete who made it to the major leagues from Beaumont. So anyway, he sells it for a large amount of money, and then he takes that money he's saving on the stadium and the sale, and he invested in the farm system, which then led to the many great Cardinal teams of the 20s, 30s, and 40s and all their trips to the World Series. And you think about, that could have been the Browns. So he really sets this template of competition because it's the Cardinals who win the pennant and go on to the World Series in 26 for the very first time in St. Louis. Now, there's another story. What if in 1922, when the Browns had one of the greatest teams of baseball, and why they didn't make the World Series? But, you know, if the Browns would have had the farm system and developed all these great players, if the Browns had made it to the World Series first over the Cardinals, things may have been different.
There's points in the book where you talk about attendance problems later on. I was wondering, because I didn't see it, when you're looking at the Cardinals and the Browns, both at Sportsman's Park, are there differences in the attendance that begin to be noticed regarding attending the different games?
Yeah. You know, depends on who was the better team. In the early 2 decades, the Browns were the better team, better attendance. Actually had the better stadium, too. I mean, keep in mind, Sportsman's Park was really kind of unique. I mean, here you played a game every day. Like back in New York, where you were from, there were 3 different stadiums. Back in Philadelphia, in Boston, different stadiums. Here, it was one stadium. Every day there was almost a game being played. That's why there was more Major League games played there than anywhere. But it was also something that was really unique here. It gave the opportunity that I think really built St. Louis as being this mecca of baseball, and because people could go, you know, and watch all the National League stars by watching the Cardinals. Then, you know, Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Jimmy Fox, you know, Bob Feller, on down to DiMaggio, man, they all came to St. Louis, so you could see them all. It did become, as I said, you know, the Cardinals, with this farm system, pumped these championship teams. You know, they went to the World Series in 26, 28, 30, 31, 34, 42, 43, 44. The city turned. The city turned and what became Cardinal Red from the Brownie Brown. You know, during the early 20s, as I spoke earlier, the Browns had one of the greatest teams of all time and some of the greatest players and hold many offensive records. And, you know, people love the Browns. But it changed.
Yeah, the record, just to give the audience, so you got a 52 seasons. They had a winning season 12 times, and then a quote you have in the book says, the worst overall record in baseball history.
Yeah.
Finished first once, 1944, second twice, last 10 times, and 7th place 12 times. There's only 8 teams,
Yeah,
which
there's
is what
8
I
teams.
remember able
8
to
teams,
count.
154 games.
Right. So that as a result, you know, then the idea of seeing sort of the downfall of the Browns from the 20s, and then after that, you start to see this sort of complete meltdown. And some of that seems, because again, I'll read a quote, and then I thought you want to talk about it. He says, odd statement, it says, of the 764 men who donned the Browns uniform, 310 played just 25 games or less with the team. That is an astonishing 41% of the total 52-year roster.
Yeah, when I went through roster, and one of the things I thought was very important was to include something about all 764 men in the back of the book, so that relatives and friends could touch and identify. They played with the Browns these years, and then I started looking at, because I would put how many games they played with the Browns, and I was like, whoa. And I became curious, and how did that work with the other teams? I mean, and I can look back and think of all the Cardinals that I have seen in 50 plus years, and how many guys were here once or twice. A couple things I think impacted the Browns. First, there were 3 wars: World War I, World War II, and Korea. And they had a lot of impact on players there was a draft then in those days, so players got drafted and had to go serve. Plus there was the nationalism that I want to serve. So a lot of players actually decided, I'm going to serve in the Army rather than play ball. So there was a lot of that. And then there was a lot of what I'll call on the cheap, because a lot of times the Browns, always in need of money, would sell the bigger player, get the cash. They bring up young guys. You think they're going to materialize, and they don't. And it's, as you introduce that paragraph there, it kind of comes to people like, why do you want to write a book on the Browns? They were losers. True, they lost 1,000 more games than they won. They lost 4,400 games, won 3,400. I mean, there were times they set records for losing, lost 111 games in 1939, 64 and a half games out of first place. I mean, what would draw people to come to when you're 64 and a half games out? We talk about today, 20,000 is a light, but I mean, there was the old adage, people would come up to the ticket box for the Browns and say, well, what time's the game? And it's like, what time do you want to be here? If we can get a crowd, we'll play at that time. But it's a little different if you go back. We're here in St. Louis, the Cardinals draw 40,000 almost every night. The season ticket holders, put in there, and it's full. If you look at the other stadiums in the other cities, there were low attendance. You weren't built. Now, Cleveland and New York were different. I put in there was one year the Browns drew about 80,000 people. Yeah. Well, that was one day or one game at Yankee Stadium or Cleveland over the course of history of time. So, but there was also a depression, a major depression where, people, not only they did not have money to feed themselves in the 30s, there was no, I've got extra money to go to a ball game, So, I mean, you have to not just look at the numbers, you have to dissect and get into the times and what were the drivers, whether you have guys who play a short time. Yeah, there were 3 wars, there was a draft. You have low attendance, what was impacting the attendance?
But sort of one guy I just want to early years, Bobby Wallace. So he's playing with the Cardinals, and what I liked in the book that you brought up about him, he was the highest paid in the majors, $32,000 a year. He eventually gets inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1953. But one of the things you was talking about in there is that you said the fact that he moved from the Cardinals to the Browns, and there are several, you have a sort of at the back, you list which ones do that. You say a bad taste in the mouths of most St. Louisans. So some reason this sets a thing where there are people that are thinking, well, the Cardinals have lost out to the Browns, and they're sort of ticked off about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was a fan loyalty. And they left. He left. He jumps to the other team. I mean, and that jumping was not just unique in St. Louis. There was jumping, as the American League was formed in 1901, there were players who jumped from the National League to the American League. There were other leagues that even transpired, federal leagues, and the American Association. So it wasn't the static set of 2 leagues that we think of today. You have to look at it. But it really did the feel of betrayal and loyalty that, Bobby Wallace, and, he played more games than anybody, didn't make a World Series, because neither the Cardinals nor the Browns made a World Series when he was playing. But he was one of the superstars of baseball at that first turn of the century, and the fact that he and a couple of the other Cardinals jumped across town, it propelled the Browns initially. It kept making them a little better team than the Cardinals, and that started that loyalty for the first 2 decades.
George Stone would be, I assume, another. He wins the batting crown 1906 with a .358 batting average.
Right.
And so, again, it would seem that when you're talking those early years, it's sort of like first we're talking about that period up until, give or take, 1922, and then from 22 on, maybe.
Yeah, well, yeah, the Browns, they had a lot of great players in those first several decades. You had Urban Shocker as a big name as a pitcher. You had Red Powell as one of their all-time leading statistical pitchers in that place. And then you had the evolution of this great offense in the late 19 teens into the 20s. Everybody knows George Sisler and what he did. I mean, to expand on him, I mean, George Sisler, he's a local St. Louisan. He's probably the most forgotten superstar in Cooperstown. I mean, what he did is beyond belief. Baltimore doesn't even recognize him. There's no statues of him up there with the franchise. As his grandchildren tell me, they just feel he is the forgotten superstar in Cooperstown. But
he was somewhat belittled when Ichiro broke his record, and I remember when that happened because up until that moment he had the hit record.
Yes.
And when Ichiro broke it, it was more like you denigrated. And this is it. Now we're really putting the death note on the Browns. This was their last holdout. Now they're gone, and it was done in a way that when you listen to the TV sports stories on it, it wasn't. You just think about the Browns, it was more like this now where it's a laughing stock. They're completely gone.
Yeah, I mean, he had that record of 257 hits in a season. Ichiro broke it in 2004. It was just, that wasn't the only time Sisler got 200 hits. He had multiple 200 hits, and I'd like to expand on that in a moment, but I don't want to lose the thought on Ichiro because, that campaign in 2004 of Ichiro versus Sisler really took me back to 1961. And I can remember the radio and listening. Was Mantle going to break Ruth's record? Was Maris going to break Ruth's record? Would there be an asterisk? Because Ruth played in 154 games. Maris 161. Ichiro played in 161 games that year in 2004. He only got 7 more hits than George Sisler. But he also batted 70 more times.
Right.
And, it's like if you look at the comparison, it's like also comparing.
I think the same thing happened regarding breaking Mathewson's strikeout record.
Right.
With, that's Sandy Koufax, if I remember.
Time,
but they don't have an asterisk next to it.
No. I mean, it's the same. We always talk about Hank Aaron. He 744 versus 714 and of Babe Ruth, but he batted 2,000 more times. I mean, there's all these little things, metrics and statistics, and you can make baseball out of. But the one thing I will say, Ichiro, from the input I have, and I'm very good friends with George Sisler's 2 grandsons, who accompanied their mother, George Sisler's daughter, to Seattle when Ichiro broke the record. How much of a gentleman and how respectful Ichiro was to the Sisler family and what Sisler meant to baseball. He was very much a gentleman.
The family went there?
Yes. Major League Baseball and the Mariners had George Sisler's daughter and grandsons come up there so they would be there at that game, and they were honored and recognized along with Ichiro when he broke the record. And in 2009, when the All-Star game was here in St. Louis, Ichiro went to George Sisler's gravesite with the family. George Sisler's buried in Des Peres, a cemetery in Des Peres, and honored George Sisler there. So I mean, wasn't a cutthroat type thing as you can see in some of these other scenarios, but it's still a thing. You're right. That was kind of the standout. And the other thing about that season in 22 with Sisler is he got hurt on September 12th. And how many more hits would he have gotten if he'd have played at his full strength? He hurt his shoulder those last 2.5 weeks. And it's also helped contribute to the Browns losing to the Yankees in Murderers Row by 1 game in that season. And it goes back to one of these what ifs. What if the Browns had won the pennant and gone to the World Series in 22 and not have to wait for the Cardinals 4 years later in 26? I mean, the Browns would have been there. They would have gotten momentum. They would have gotten revenue.
To some extent, your book is a before and after. You're looking at from 1902 to 1922, and then sort of a post-1922, you slowly see this decline.
Well, there's several things in there. And before I leave the 20s, I always tell people you want a good trivia contest. What is the best outfield in baseball?
Right.
And it goes down to the Browns had 3 outfielders. Kenny Williams in left, Baby Doll Jacobson, and that's what's fun. You write these books, you get these names like Baby Doll Jacobson, and Johnny Tobin in right. 5 straight years, these 3 men hit over 300. And it would have been 6 years if Johnny Tobin had got one more hit. He wound up hitting 299. But no collective baseball team has ever had the same 3 guys hit over 300 5 years in a row. And this also, we look at the end of the year statistics of just this last year. I mean, find some guys that get 200 hits. The thing that there's not that many teams who have players get 200 hits. Very few. But that was interesting, the Browns would have 3 guys get 200 hits. Not just once, but twice in consecutive years. So, I mean, they were this offensive powerhouse of the 20s with their pitching, their great offense, and even great defense. I can't leave the George Sisler comment with. He was one of the greatest defensive first basemen in baseball. He gets a little overshadowed because of Lou Gehrig's power. And the thing about Sisler, he came into baseball with Branch Rickey. Branch Rickey was his coach at Michigan and brought him to St. Louis when Rickey came. As a pitcher, he was a pitcher, and like Ruth, he was too good to pitch he needed to play every day.
We only have a moment left. Let me just add, I like the book. It's nice the way it's laid out, and I particularly like the insertion of telegrams and letters in different sects, because this way allows you to not just see a little picture. And so the idea that it's just a picture book would be an inaccurate statement to make. But the insertions are very insightful, because then you get a sense of how you're taking a look at this development. And so what you look at in there was a good selection. And so I just want to point out this is actually the first of 2 shows we're going to be doing. So there will be a second one that we're doing on the book, since there's quite a bit to cover. So, Ed, we're going to stop there, but recommend the book. Quite good.